Welcome back. In a moment, we'll examine the moments when fashion met politics. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. It's emerged that an Australian pilot who died when his light aircraft crashed into a shopping centre had already been investigated for a near collision in 2015. 4 passengers also died when the plane suffered catastrophic engine failure in Melbourne shortly after takeoff. Hong Kong's former chief executive has been sentenced to 20 months in prison for misconduct. Donald Tsang led Hong Kong from 2005 to 2012 and is the most senior official in the territory to stand trial for corruption. And major evacuations are underway in California neighborhood, which was submerged in water after a creek overflowed. Firefighters in San Jose rescued more than 200 people by boat, with some residents saying the water rose so quickly they had no time to prepare to move to higher ground. Back now to the subject of fashion. The politics surrounding the rise of modest clothing is just the latest in a long history of moments when a new trend has meant more than a change of clothes. Here's a quick look at just a few key moments in fashion history.
Coco Chanel is thought to have revolutionized the way women dress. Breaking away from corseted styles in the 1920s was a radical move. The brand became famous for its loose and boxy jackets, recreated by many. The punk movement of the late 70s was a backlash against the etherealness established by the late 60s and formed an anti-establishment voice echoed by anarchist groups. The look was deliberately confrontational and masculine. First created solely for sports purposes, trainers became synonymous for their street-style appeal and worn as an anti-fashion statement. Now integrated into daily life, the footwear style can be found on the front row at Fashion Week. Slogan t-shirts have been used in various popular movements promoting human rights issues, animal rights or ethical fashion, with the runway, sports field and red carpet proving no exception.
To discuss that further, I'm joined by Pamela Church-Gibson, who is a reader in cultural and historical studies at the London College of Fashion, University of London. She's also the author of Fashion and Celebrity Culture. Pamela, thanks for joining us. Now, a lot of people, myself included, don't necessarily buy clothes with the idea that they have some sort of political significance. Am I missing a trick here?
I don't think so, because generally, with a very few exceptions, fashion reflects political trends rather than attempts to influence them. If that makes sense.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, you know, if, for example, unless you buy a slogan T-shirt saying "Get rid of Donald Trump," then you're not necessarily. I mean, slogan T-shirts are very different, and you know they are going to come up in what we talk about. But I mean, general fashion trends tend to reflect general changes in society. Chanel, for example, I mean, if we want to start by talking about Chanel, I mean, Chanel reflected the changed lives of women in the 1920s. If you think about the aftermath of the First World War, the traditional options for women of marriage and motherhood had been removed by the dearth of marriageable men after the enormous losses in the First World War. And Chanel wanted to reflect women's changed lives. By the time she became a really famous designer in the 1920s, the jazz age had begun, women were living in different ways, women were going out to work. Chanel wanted to offer women freedom. And her designs, the suit came much, much later in the 1950s. Her early designs in the 20s she wanted to give women the freedom that she found in menswear. She tended to wear, she liked wearing men's sweaters, cardigans, she wore fisherman's T-shirts. She borrowed the cardigans and sweaters from her lover and or whoever, but she wanted to reflect that. And she did say that she would free women from the tyranny of their corsets. So she creates tubular shapes, and they're made out of soft fabrics, cotton, jersey, whatever. Instead of the sort of light, fussy colors, she uses a palette which is neutral or black and white. And of course, she famously created the little black dress in the 1920s.
So would you say she represents, if you like, this a fashion designer who really epitomizes a zeitgeist, this moment in history when there's a transition in women's role, and her choice to design clothes in a certain way reflects that moment. But to come back to the slogans on T-shirts, because we've seen quite a few of those at New York Fashion Week, and a lot of anti-Trump symbolism, a lot of support for the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes.
To what extent is any of that activism actually contributing to change, and to what extent is it actually really just speaking to the echo chamber of fashion world?
Well, for example, I think it's very interesting that Dior had that T-shirt on the catwalk, "We should all be feminists." But that, as you say, is reflecting a kind of zeitgeist. I think the New York Fashion Week thing was very different, because just about every show had some reference, both, you know, to Donald Trump and specifically to the Muslim ban, for example, the ban of, you know, the ban of people from 7 Muslim countries, and women. Women, and also, as you said, Black Lives Matter. There's 3 things that Trump is seen as, Trump is seen as needing to be opposed on. And I think it's very interesting because fashion designers don't normally do something so forceful. So, I mean, that was really noticeable about
So you would say that fashion designers are becoming more political?
No, I think New York are, because I think just, with the exception of a very few designers, for example, Melania Trump famously wore, Ralph Lauren to her inauguration in a parody of Jackie Kennedy. I think, designers are refusing to dress Melania Trump. Stores are dropping Ivanka Trump's fashion lines and so on. And I think that is very, very different, because in America, people have a very specific problem. And, they're mobilizing just about everything they can think of to address it. It'll be interesting to see what happens at London Fashion Week, or what has happened, because it's much more muted, really.
I mean, yeah, we had a little bit about the punk movement there, and a lot of people look at that as being a movement which actually did have a strong political significance, and in fact, strong implications for social change. Is punk, or was the punk movement in fashion an anomaly, or are there other examples?
I think the punk thing is actually very interesting, because although it's very much seen as a street culture which was generated on the streets, one of the most famous punk bands was dressed by Vivienne Westwood. Johnny Rotten was a customer. He was just flicking through the clothes in Vivienne Westwood's shop, which at that time was called Sex, a shop on King's Road that went through various stages.
And Vivienne Westwood, very political, of course. Yeah.
Yes, well, Vivienne Westwood is very political. Malcolm McLaren, of course, was much more of an opportunist. And he saw Johnny Rotten with his dyed green hair, and he decided to build a band around him. But the punks who took this up, I think, were genuinely interested in the whole kind of no future. I mean, if you think about it, it's a time when full employment has suddenly disappeared after 2 decades. So it is linked to that. And I mean, one of the things about punk fashion is it's supposed to be very kind of in your face, very confrontational. The Queen, safety pins, fabrics like latex and rubber, which of course were very transgressive. But it's interesting that a lot of this was guided by Vivienne Westwood, whose clothes were very expensive. And I think it is worth thinking about that.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting, especially given the rise in more political trends in fashion these days. But thank you very much, Pamela. That's all for now. I'm Myriam Francois. That was Insight.